What is an adaptation? What, do you think I'm just gonna do the regular YouTube thing and pull up a definition? Okay, yeah, I will, so that we're all on the same page, but I generally want to know how many of you can accurately define one? And I guess more importantly, what do you actually want from an adaptation? Merriam-Webster describes an adaptation as a composition rewritten into a new form. To adapt something is considered to make fit, often by modification. Christopher Nolan recently made an adaptation of the Odyssey, and I loved it. It's not perfect, of course, but I give it a 9 out of 10. He's a generally good director. I loved all of the scenery, I loved the music. Some of the audio was a bit quiet in some cases, or just too mumbled to understand. But otherwise, pretty good. Now, when talking about the Odyssey, specifically it being an adaptation of Homer's original work, I think I should at least acknowledge the discourse surrounding it. I am aware that there's some contention about Nolan using Wilson's 2017 translation of the Odyssey. I've heard that apparently it downplays Homer's pride. I am not in a position to compare Wilson's translation to other translations. What I can say, however, is that the goal of Wilson's translation was specifically to capture the Odyssey as an oral text, and what I mean by that is Wilson's goal was to try and write the Odyssey in a way that would have actually been said by criers, by mentors, by teachers, who were communicating the Odyssey to other people long before enough people were literate enough to, read the Odyssey en masse. I also can't ignore that plenty of people just straight up hated Lupita Nyong'o, as well as Elliot Page, just because a trans man and a black woman were in a movie. I won't go into that specifically, that's already been talked about a lot, but I just want to let you know that I am aware of it, and I hope I can bring at least some new arguments or talking points about Nolan's work as an adaptation of Homer's. I want everyone to understand that this movie technically isn't Homer's, it's Nolan's. It's an adaptation of Homer's work, but Nolan, as an artist, has creative liberty over the movie he is making. I know a lot of people really wanted a very accurate and faithful interpretation of Homer's original work just put to screen, and I am sorry you didn't get what you wanted. I'm sure if Nolan really tried, he could have made something that was one-to-one perfect with the original in movie form, but that's simply not what he wanted to do, and adaptations, by definition, require the artist to make something new. It requires modifications to bring something into a new format, hence adaptation. It's adapting to the new medium. That doesn't mean adaptations or any forms of remaking original work isn't allowed to be criticized. No. I've seen people play Campaign Evolved, and a very funny criticism of that game that I've heard is that it has yellow paint dialogue, and I can't argue. Cortana doesn't shut up ever. Not to mention there's also the DMC reboot from, over 10 years ago now, and that was hated because it almost had nothing that people liked from the original Devil May Cry games. Nolan's work isn't perfect, I'm not going to pretend that it is. What I am saying is to at least be more cautious when talking about faithfulness, because some changes are expected for an adaptation. If you really wanted a perfect one-to-one with the original work by Homer, then why don't you just read the original book? Why do you want to see Homer's work on the big screen? Why do you want an adaptation if you don't like when adaptations adapt? Because, by definition, you should expect some changes. A little while ago, I got into the Scott Pilgrim series, and I freaking love it. I've watched the movie, I've seen the show, I'm in the middle of reading the comics. I'm loving the story so much, and one of the things that I do love about it is how it is so different across all of these different mediums. I love that Brian Lee O'Malley is willing to take different routes with these characters to spice up the story a little bit. I love that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is so very much unlike even all of the other adaptations, very much unlike the comic or the movie, and it works, honestly. I love how he takes a different direction with these characters to explore them on their own without Scott Pilgrim in their lives. It's what I want from an adaptation. I don't want to hear the same story again, and I don't think Brian Lee O'Malley wanted to rewrite the same story again because he already made the comic, so why would he just make the comic but with a screen? Like, be real with me, why would you want that? You already have the original work. It's not like adaptations, by definition, erase the original work from existence, but yet you still want it to be perfectly one-to-one with the original work? Why wouldn't you want changes or a reinterpretation of these characters? Wouldn't that be more exciting and interesting? I want you to keep in mind that the goal of an adaptation isn't to one-up the original. That's not at all what I am saying. I'm not trying to say that Nolan's work is better than Homer's. What I am saying is that it would be boring just to have the exact same characters with the exact same personality act the exact same way and make the exact same decisions because you already know what happens. I want to give you some examples of some pretty good adaptations that I have seen over the years. I love the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I love this kooky cast of characters that keep trying to kill each other, and I love seeing them learn to deal with each other, work through each other's problems, and look out for one another. You get so emotionally invested into them. I love them to bits. Here's what the Guardians looked like in the 60s. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't even know who any of these characters are. This isn't, like, what most people know Guardians of the Galaxy for. They know the Guardians for the James Gunn movies, and that's fine. In fact, this version of the Guardians of the Galaxy wasn't completely original. It was based on a team formed in 2008, and even then, it's not one-to-one, because one of the characters doesn't even show up in the movies. And yet, people love the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, myself included, obviously. Another example I can think of is the Absolute DC series, specifically Absolute Batman, because that's the one I've been reading, and I love it to death so much. I love how brutal it is, I love how it pushes Batman to his absolute limit. And I love how you see Batman be such an inventive character who's always on his toes, who's always thinking 2 steps ahead. Even though he doesn't have necessarily all of the equipment or money in the world, he is still able to fight crime just as any other Bruce Wayne would. And I'm not the only one who's loving Absolute Batman. A lot of other people really love Absolute Batman as well. Wait, so if comics adapt comics, that's fine. Hell, sometimes even if comics are adapted into movies, that's fine. But when old poems are adapted into movies, there's like an obligation to be one-to-one perfect with the source material? It feels very confusing as to what changes people actually want and whether or not they want to see something new to begin with. One point that I have seen brought up before, and one that I think is actually really good, is to consider the fact that the Odyssey isn't just a series of poems, or at least it wasn't always considered that. It was deeply embedded into people's culture and livelihood. People believed in the gods and cyclopses and all these other mythological creatures. It was part of their daily life to worship the gods, and you have to consider that whenever you adapt the work or even just read it. And I get that. I get where that is coming from. It's very important to acknowledge other people's cultures and try not to spit on them. The thing is, I don't entirely see how Nolan does that. There's no moment in the film where, like, he's stroking his ego or anything, or saying that Homer's work is bad. I don't understand why Nolan would try to disrespect Homer at all. I don't know if this is contentious when it comes to adapting stories based on religious beliefs, but I'm fine with changes and reinterpretations to the narrative of religious stories. As long as the adapter isn't deliberately trying to make fun of religion or the people who believe in that religion, I feel it's important to use art as a vessel to provide different perspectives about religious stories, about what they could mean, and about the people that they affected in the story, as well as what those stories mean to us in the current day. I feel like a lot of people these days really sleep on the movie Prince of Egypt. I thought it was a very, very striking film, very well animated, very well shot, and it's really haunting. I remember seeing it and being surprised at how scary God is portrayed when he talks to Moses through the burning bush, and the film doesn't shy away from, like, the horrors of the plagues that God unleashed onto Egypt. Like, yeah, he really just killed a bunch of children. Like, this is stuff that you stop to think about in the film and realize this is kind of screwed up. I actually have read Exodus. I've read the passages in my own Bible that a friend gifted to me. What I found interesting was that the plagues, relative to the movie, were kind of glossed over. They're not given the attention that the film gives the plagues. You really don't sit and think about how horrifying seeing this river that you've visited time and time again just all of a sudden turn to blood, or being swarmed with moths and flies, or again, seeing your kid just die because of something you weren't involved in. Prince of Egypt is a very memorable, iconic, and important film because it provides us with a new lens of which to view the biblical story of Moses. If people want a one-to-one adaptation of Moses exactly as how he was written in the original work, and they want the story to play out beat by beat, why do those people want that in film form? Why don't they just read the Bible again? Like, I fail to see the point of an adaptation if you just want the original material. It isn't exactly like Nolan's film is going to erase the original work. Yes, it is going to temporarily be very popular, and when people think of The Odyssey, people are going to think of Nolan's film first and then the original work for a good while, but we're going to see it as just an adaptation of this great piece of poetry later on in life anyway. As long as there's translations being sold and made, Homer's work isn't going anywhere, and neither is Nolan's interpretation of it, and I'm happy. I get to see this story told from two different viewpoints, and I find them both interesting, frankly. I love seeing changes be made to stories because I want to see authors try and analyze what makes the original poem relevant today, why it was relevant back then, and how can it be even more relevant today. And of course, maybe there can be some improvements that made. I'm not saying that Homer's work is terrible or anything. I'm just saying with adaptations in general, if you can make an improvement, I would advise that you do. I've heard a lot of criticism about the original Boys comic run, and at the very least for season 1 and 2, I've heard that they make some pretty good improvements upon the original work. Art is so amazing because frankly you can do so much with it, and it kind of pains me to see people actively discourage artists from making changes or trying to make art more relevant to the modern day. I'm not saying The Odyssey isn't at all relevant to the modern day, but it is an old text written primarily for people from thousands of years ago. There's gotta be some things that aren't going to connect with audiences of today the same way they connected with audiences of Homer's time. All I ask is that you be more open to change, because that's what makes art more interesting. When I play the remake of Resident Evil 4, I'm not really looking for a one-to-one interpretation of the original game, because I already have that game. Why would I pay up to like $70 for a game that I already own? I want to see changes. I want to see if there can be some improvements made. I want to see how the story is told differently so that new themes can be brought up. And most importantly, I don't want art to just become this Cerebrus that just swallows itself continuously like it mostly is today with all of these remakes and adaptations that just cling to nostalgia and don't actually try to reinvent anything or try to significantly push the story or the mythos of any of these incredible worlds. But if you were wanting a one-to-one adaptation of the Odyssey, if you still just want everything played out exactly the same as it was in Homer's original poems, just on the big screen, then I still want to ask you, why do you want an adaptation?